What's up, everyone? So in this episode, we're doing another listener request. A while ago, and I'm so sorry it took me this long to get to it, but a while ago, Derrek sent me a message on Instagram. He was getting ready to make his first property purchase, and we had a discussion about what sort of property amenities I avoid or what type of situations at properties that I steer clear of when I'm purchasing my buy and hold rentals. I did offer Derrek my advice through Instagram Messenger, but he did suggest I make this a podcast topic, so alas, here it is. And lastly, I just want to say that normally I don't plan these type of episodes for the podcast because I try not to make this the me, I show, because honestly, I'm not a fan of those podcasts. So anytime we dive into an episode where I'm giving you my opinions, my preferences, 9 times out of 10, it's going to come from a viewer request. But with all that said, let's dive into my no list for buy and hold rentals. So over the years, I have been blessed to have experience wearing many different hats. I obviously started out wearing the hat as a daughter and granddaughter of an investor, and then I became a property manager. Now I'm an investor myself. Now I'm also a realtor myself. But all this is to say that I've been able to look at property purchases from various perspectives. And because of that, I have created a list of what I consider the situations I avoid with property amenities and property specifics when I'm making a purchase for a long-term rental. So this is a list of the things that I absolutely avoid. If a property has any of these qualities associated with it, I avoid the property purchase. With each of these, I'm going to go through individually what the reasoning is behind this and why I feel so strongly about it. So first on the list is I will not buy a property that has a lack of off-street parking and logical off-street parking. Let me explain this a little bit. So I've always sort of had this opinion that rentals obviously do better when they have parking available for those that rent, because the last thing on earth people want to worry about when they get home from work is trying to find a parking spot. Now, I've taken this a step further and I've said I don't want a property with illogical parking. This might be the part that needs a little bit of explanation. And the best way to explain it is to give you an example. I was recently asked by an investor colleague who purchased a property about 35 minutes from my home to go over and give him an opinion on some remodel situation that was going on inside. When I arrived, I was struck at the parking situation at this property. First off, it's on a street which is a very narrow street. So we're talking about like one of those streets that the city plans and they're basically trying to fit in as many homes in a neighborhood as they possibly can. So it's really, really narrow street where it's not even wider than a 2-lane country highway. And there's parking going on both sides of the street. Now I thought, okay, hopefully this place has some good off-street parking. When I actually walked up to the property, which I had to walk a little bit, by the way, about a half a block to get to the property because of a lack of parking nearby, I discovered that the driveway, which was included, was a one-way driveway, meaning it did not feed out into an alley. And there was no parking spaces available in the back. It was just a straight single-lane driveway. Here's my issue with this. When you're renting out a multifamily, which is what this was, you're going to have one tenant that can park in that driveway. The other tenant will not be able to because they're going to be blocked in that driveway. Couple that with the fact of the lack of off-street parking or on-street parking that was available. There was obviously going to be parking in the forefronts of prospective tenants' minds when they came to see this place. And that was something that I expressed to my colleague. Unfortunately, it was obviously after the fact, but I said, hey, going forward, just so you know, if you go to a property, or your realtor does, and there's parking on both sides of the street and the street is narrow, you've really got to be sure that your off-street parking is on game, especially when you're dealing with a multifamily. Just because you have a driveway here doesn't mean it's going to be a really marketable asset because only one tenant can use the driveway. And even then, that one tenant that can, if they have a roommate or a spouse or a significant other, they need to kind of plan ahead who's going to park where based on their schedules. And it kind of makes it this hassle, because parking is one of those things that people don't want to have to think about. If they have to think about something as simple as that, their life is becoming too complicated in their mind. So when I look at a property, I want to be sure that there's off-street parking, and I want to be sure that it's logical off-street parking, meaning that there's places for cars to park, there's places maybe for a car to turn around, or maybe it feeds straight back into an alleyway, so it's basically a two-way driveway. Item number 2 on my no-go list, that's what I'm going to call this, is my no-go list. That's actually what I call it to my realtor clients. I ask them to give me a list of things that they absolutely do not want to see at a rental property. So second on my no-go list is a bathroom that is only accessible through a bedroom. Now, let me just say that for the purposes of this conversation, I'm strictly talking about bathrooms that are the main bathroom in the unit. There are single-family homes out there that have Jack and Jill bathrooms, which is where 2 bedrooms are attached and sharing a bathroom, but there's another bathroom somewhere in the house. I'm not talking about that situation. I'm strictly talking about rentals where in order to get to the only bathroom, you have to go through a bedroom. This was something I did not necessarily think about when I first started in real estate, and it only got brought to my attention as a property manager about 3.5, maybe 4 years ago. One of my clients had purchased a rental property, and it was their first purchase. It was a really beautiful turn-of-the-century building, wonderful mahogany hardwood floors, very nice glossy finish, beautiful architectural detail, built-in cabinets. This place was amazing, both upper and lower units. When we went to rent out both the units because it was acquired vacant, one of the things that I did not expect to hear back from my leasing agent was how much of a deterrent it was having the only bathroom accessible through a bedroom. And this really was something that at first I'm like, really? Oh, and then it dawned on me. Because when people have guests over, that person has to walk through their bedroom, their most private quarters, to use the bathroom. If they share the situation with a roommate, that roommate is going to have to walk through their bedroom in the middle of the night or early in the morning to get to the bathroom to use the bathroom. And if that's where the shower is, that's where the toilet is, that's where everything is, the person that's living in that bedroom attached to the bathroom is obviously going to be inconvenienced. So me personally, I steer clear of rental units where the bathroom is only accessible through the bedroom. If you're curious, and I know some of you are like, whoa, I just recently bought a unit like that, or I have one, I haven't had to re-rent it out yet. I will tell you from experience that unfortunately, we did have to lower the price. And I really, truly think lowering the price came down to the fact that the only bathroom was accessible through the bedroom. All right, item number 3 on my no-go list, and this is probably going to be a slightly controversial one, but I will not buy a property that requires the landlord to pay for heat. I am not a fan of including heat in the utilities that the landlord pays. I openly own duplexes where I pay for the water. To me, not quite such a big situation monetarily. But what I have seen with heat being included is that it's an invitation for the tenants to turn the heat all the way up to 80 degrees. And there's like this momentary lack of logic, because when it gets too warm in the apartment, rather than turning down the heat, some of them will just open a window and let winter in, let Mother Nature in. And then the heat is just constantly cycling through to 80 degrees, 80 degrees, 80 degrees. So for this reason, I do not buy rentals that have heat included. So if I'm looking at a property that has a situation where there's heat included, I'm going to be finding out if I can possibly change that situation. Do I have maybe just where I need separate electrical meters going through the place? Do I need to put in individual furnaces for the units? What do I need to do? I'm really trying to avoid that situation at all costs because I personally don't feel like there's many situations where the landlord ends up making their money back. Now, of course, there are things nowadays where you can monitor heat usage remotely. This gets into a really kind of shady gray area, which I talk about in a really, really old blog, which maybe I should resurrect. Because with smart thermostats, things like that, we have the ability to keep tabs on items like this. But you're really kind of crossing into a gray area when you kind of hyper police your tenants in that way. But anyway, landlord paid heat is a situation I completely avoid with my rental properties. The last item on my no-go list is buying a property with common recreational amenities. Every once in a while, we will come across a multifamily on the market, and there will be a playground in the back, one that specifically belongs to the property. There might be a pool in the backyard. I've seen some with hot tubs on decks that are shared between the tenants. And that is a situation that I completely nope myself away from. Let me explain why I nope myself away from those. Number one, there's a lot of liability with any of those three that I just said. So a playground for kids to play on, obviously you're responsible for making sure that it's safe. It's safe and secure to the ground. It's not rusty. You know, obviously you have the situation where if a kid gets hurt, you could be liable. Swimming pool, you have the situation where obviously somebody drowns and you need to keep up with it. Just the financial wise, keeping a pool up is not inexpensive. It requires a lot of chemicals. It requires running the heater in the winter. It requires running, filtration sometimes, depending on the pools that you have. So there's a lot of cost involved with a pool, and the same thing goes with a hot tub. Obviously, a hot tub is still a drowning risk as well. So those are also things that I avoided a rental property. I know you're probably thinking, like, I've never seen a rental property with these. I can be honest that between helping people purchase properties and also what I've seen on showings myself, I've actually been kind of surprised at how many properties I will see that have these. And what is kind of really the surprising factor is that all of these amenities are usually found on side-by-side duplexes. I don't know what it is about those builds, but side-by-side duplexes are where you tend to find playgrounds that are included, hot tubs, swimming pools. For some reason, I don't know what it is about those layouts or those builders or whatever it is, but they really sort of attract common property amenities. Now, let me just say that I'm not against those on a very large scale. So once you get into like 40 units, 60 units, and it's part of a complex, then my feelings on these start to change. But when we're talking about small multifamily, these are absolutely items that I walk away from. One of the properties that I currently own now, it had a pool in the back from when it was a single family home. The previous owners had filled it up, used it, allowed the tenants to use it, but that was something that we were definitely not interested in. So the pool got drained, and then eventually it got filled with dirt, which is just now hilarious because there's basically the very top rim of the pool shows, but then there's this nice grassy situation in the middle of the concrete patio. But anyway, we have avoided those situations because in small multifamilies, it's just not necessarily worth the risk. So you talk about risk versus reward. A small multifamily, there's not too much reward necessarily in having those items. I view it as much more higher of a risk than an actual reward. Now, that being said, I'm sure some of you out there are like, whoa, how come you didn't mention this? So let's go through a couple items which are not necessarily honorable mentions, but you're probably like, I'm surprised they weren't on her list. So one of the first ones you guys are probably going to think about is going to be the age of the property. If you've been here long enough, you know that I love history. I love old homes. So for that reason, it just seems logical for me to combine my love of history and my passion for real estate. So I actually love to buy older properties. The newer ones, they just don't have pizzazz for me. They just don't have character. Now, don't get me wrong. If a good one falls into my lap that's newer, it's not like I'm going to walk away from it because it isn't older. But I'm not walking away from the older ones because I'm afraid of the maintenance or I'm afraid of the lead-based paint or anything like that. I understand what comes along with that. I've been around these as types of investments for years because it's the type of investment that my father used to typically get as well. So I don't have that fear of having an older property. The other thing that many people probably expected me to have on this podcast is having paid water by the landlord. This is just something I grew up with being the norm, that my father always paid the water on his investments. Even my grandfather did back in the day. So for me, it was just one of those things that I thought it was weird that there were duplexes out there where the tenant did pay the water on their own. For me, that was foreign. The norm for me was paying the water. And then the last item that many people are probably going to be surprised was not on the list, was buying a rental property that is in the country or not in a city. Now, some of you might be thinking, oh, I never thought about that being on a no list. Now, many of you think you should really buy a rental property in an area that has a high concentration of renters, specifically in that city. And that's a fine strategy. That's a fine belief. There's nothing wrong with it. It's totally correct. The most efficient property to rent and to keep leased out is likely going to be one that is in a highly populated area. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about a huge metropolitan. Even your smaller cities would be fine examples of renting something out. So smaller cities, what comes to mind is Cedar Rapids, Iowa, Ames, Iowa. Those are kind of smaller towns that are not huge metropolitans, not by any stretch of the imagination, but they're adequate for renting out a property. At the same time, you can have little cities in the suburbs of those areas that are smaller than those cities. And I honestly don't necessarily run away from a rental property that is in a less populated city. So something that's in a very small city, as long as it's located close in proximity to one of those larger cities, to a larger city, I'm going to be okay with it. I don't look specifically at buying in a city. I think as long as it's within like 10 to 15 minutes of most of the amenities a person could want, then it's an okay investment. Here in Wisconsin, there's a smaller town called Johnson Creek. It's off of I-94 near Madison. It's a major sort of truck thoroughfare, travel thoroughfare, because you get off at 94 in Johnson Creek. Either you take it one way to head towards Fort Atkinson, Jefferson, Janesville, Beloit, or you get off it and you head the other direction. You head towards Beaver Dam, Sun Prairie, places like that that are highly populated. Now, Johnson's Creek itself doesn't have too large of a population, but it has a lot of traffic that feeds into it. So that's a city that I am okay investing in because I know in close proximity, it has a lot of those smaller yet larger cities that would offer up a rental population for that area. So that's something that I don't mind doing. I'm not going to buy something out in the middle of nowhere. Here's a great example. When we were primary house searching, we went and saw a home in a small community I had never really heard of before. I didn't bother really truly studying a map before we went to see it, but it turns out we would have had to drive 25 minutes to get to anything more than a 10 to 7 p.m. gas station. In that situation, I was completely uninterested in renting or buying that home, actually. That was a purchase. So we end up moving on with that. That is also an example of an area I would not rent from because, again, the amenities are too far out. So maybe that does deserve to be an honorable mention on my no-go list, but generally speaking, I'm not necessarily requiring myself to buy in the heart of a city with a certain population. I'm more looking at the area as a whole rather than individual parts, and I'm saying, okay, I want to buy here, and there's Smithtown, there's Washington, there's Jefferson. These are all places that feed into this small town that I found this rental property for sale in. They're in relatively close proximity. I'm okay pulling the trigger. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and you know what? These episodes are sometimes fun for me once I get into them. I hate dreading the I, but yet once I get into it, I really feel like most of the time I'm able to give you guys a little bit of perspective of what it's like to be in my world as an investor. And I think this is true. Hearing people's stories about what they try and avoid and why is probably one of the bigger assets you can have when you're talking to someone that is an experienced real estate investor. I hope you enjoyed this episode, guys. If you have any suggestions, I say this all the time, but I mean it wholeheartedly. Hit me up over on Instagram, Landlord Chick over there. You can find me on Bigger Pockets. Let me know your questions. Let me know your podcast suggestions. I love your suggestions. I love hearing from you guys. And I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Building a real estate portfolio is as much about buying properties as being a de facto entrepreneur. I'm Karina Ufinger. I'm a multi-property investor, rental management company CEO, and also a landlord coach. I'm going to show you the systems and knowledge you need to thrive as a real estate entrepreneur. From your first property purchase to building a portfolio of passive income where you work less than 5 hours a week, you'll learn the essential information and skills to build a profitable portfolio and live the life you truly want. Whether you're well on your journey or just starting out, you're in the right place. Welcome to the Landlord Chick podcast.